At 36,000 feet on Flight 1742, a violent act shattered the uneasy calm of the cabin. A repugnant white man named Warren Caldwell, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that oozed privilege and disdain, struck Elijah Carter, a 16-year-old young man with gentle eyes and a tender heart, with a savage slap that left his cheek burning like wildfire. The harsh sound of flesh meeting flesh silenced all 237 passengers, each frozen in shock as the act of racism unfolded before their eyes. "I told you to stay in your place, boy," Caldwell spat, in a tone dripping with contempt, his words cutting as deeply as his blow. In that charged moment, the deep divide between privilege and vulnerability, hate and hope, became brutally clear. Before boarding, Elijah had already carried the heavy burden of racial prejudice. His father, a revered cardiothoracic surgeon known for his meticulous nature, had raised him with sky-high expectations. Yet Elijah's sensitive spirit was constantly under siege by a society that saw his achievements as exceptions rather than the norm. Every dismissive glance from a well-dressed corporate executive and every patronizing remark from a stranger stung like icy needles. As he squeezed his worn backpack into the last available spot in the cramped economy cabin, the whispered biases and sneers of fellow travelers felt like personal attacks that deepened his silent sorrow. Then, as if destiny itself had arrived to tip the scales, an unassuming veteran in his mid-60s rose from his seat with deliberate determination. His voice, steady and resonant, broke the oppressive silence when he announced, "I cannot allow this injustice to continue." That statement, simple yet powerful, reverberated through the cabin like a rallying cry. His intervention was not just an act of bravery. It was a promise of retribution that would shake the very foundations of Caldwell's cruel dominance. In that moment, the stifled air turned electric with anticipation, as passengers braced for an unfolding confrontation that promised to be nothing short of historic. The tension escalated rapidly as Caldwell, his face twisted in rage and a deep-seated loathing, hurled more venomous words at Elijah. The young man's heart pounded with a mix of terror and defiant resolve. The accumulated weight of years spent facing racial injustice, personal loss, and constant societal dismissal ignited within him a spark of determination. Despite his youth and the unyielding pressure of expectations, Elijah felt a surge of inner strength that dared him to fight back. The ensuing clash between the merciless cruelty of Caldwell and the righteous indignation of those who had long suffered discrimination promised a moment of cathartic revenge so grand that onlookers would be left in awe. This was not merely a confrontation in a cramped airplane cabin. It was a dramatic reckoning where even the most vulnerable could rise, reclaim their dignity, and demand the respect that had been denied them for far too long. Elijah Carter found himself caught in a maelstrom of tension high above the earth on Flight 1742, a journey that promised to test every fiber of his spirit. As the aircraft ascended toward a cruising altitude of 36,000 feet, he settled into his seat in the cramped economy cabin, his heart still pounding from the earlier confrontation. Beside him sat Sophie, a bright and vivacious young woman with unusual amber eyes that shone like polished topaz against her olive complexion. Their brief conversation before takeoff had been punctuated by playful banter and secret notes passed back and forth on a small notepad. A simple yet defiant gesture that had filled Elijah with a cautious spark of hope amidst the bitter taste of discrimination. Their tender moment was abruptly interrupted by the intrusive behavior of a well-to-do man in a tailored gray suit, whose irritation was written all over his face. His aggressive tapping on his tablet and dismissive tone as he demanded quiet reminded Elijah all too vividly of the racial prejudice he had endured his entire life. The man's elbow nudged Elijah's arm away from the shared armrest, a silent assertion of his unearned entitlement. Normally, Elijah would have yielded with a quiet apology, as he had been conditioned to do in those predominantly white spaces, but today was different. Today, buoyed by the memory of his father's proud embrace and Sophie's infectious warmth, Elijah deliberately slid his arm back onto the armrest. The man stiffened in silent fury, his glare seething with contempt. This small act of resistance, however minor it might seem, set the stage for an escalating conflict that promised a reckoning none would soon forget. As the aircraft's engines roared to life and Captain Rivera's steady voice announced their departure for a 4-hour and 35-minute journey to Los Angeles, every passenger could sense that the simmering tension was far from being contained. The flight attendant's cheerful reminders to fasten seatbelts and stow away personal items did little to mask the undercurrent of hostility radiating from the suited man. His eyes, dark and calculating, never left Elijah, as if he were marking him for some future punishment. Meanwhile, Sophie's notepad scribbles continued to convey messages of camaraderie and light-hearted defiance. With each exchange, the small victory of maintaining her spirit in the face of condescension warmed Elijah's heart, even as the oppressive weight of the world's prejudice bore down on him. Beyond their row, the cabin was a microcosm of American society's divides. In one section, wealthy business travelers lounged with an air of entitlement, while in another, the economy class was crammed together like sardines in a tin. Every whispered comment and side glance seemed to reinforce the notion that some lives were valued far more than others. Elijah recalled the many times he had been made to feel less than human, his achievements celebrated as miraculous exceptions rather than the norm. His mind wandered back to his childhood, to the days when every unearned slight was a heavy reminder of the burden he carried simply for being a young black man. Today, that burden was shared by his defiant act against the suited man, a gesture that was both a personal reclaiming of dignity and a spark that promised something far more monumental in the hours to come. As the plane began to taxi and the engines rumbled with growing intensity, a series of small yet significant interactions unfolded. Sophie casually remarked in a conspiratorial whisper conveyed through her notepad that this was her first time flying to Los Angeles, a destination that held both promise and bittersweet memories. Elijah, whose own journey had been marred by the dual burdens of familial expectation and racial prejudice, scribbled back with wry humor about science competitions and the absurdity of fate. Their banter, though light on the surface, belied a deeper truth, a mutual understanding that they were both navigating worlds that often seemed intent on suppressing their true selves. At the same time, the suited man's disapproving glare deepened with every laugh they shared. His interjections, curt and dripping with thinly veiled disdain, grew increasingly frequent. "Some of us have important matters to attend to," he snapped when Sophie's laughter bubbled up again, his tone leaving no room for further conversation. His hostility was not simply a matter of annoyance, it was a manifestation of a lifetime steeped in prejudice and a rigid sense of superiority. Elijah could feel the old wounds of discrimination pricking at his skin once more, each slight a reminder of a society that refused to see his worth. Yet, in that moment, he also felt a stirring of defiance, a growing determination to no longer be cowed by the cruelty of men like him. While the tension in Elijah's immediate vicinity was palpable, another narrative was unfolding just a few rows back. Michael Kovach, a man whose gentle eyes belied decades of hardship, sat quietly in seat 23D. At 66 years old, Michael was a retired Vietnam veteran whose recent diagnosis of stage 4 pancreatic cancer had shattered his comfortable existence. Just days earlier, while tending to his beloved garden in Decatur, Michael had received the devastating news that he had only 4 to 6 months left to live. Instead of succumbing to despair, however, Michael resolved to set right an old wrong that had haunted him since the turbulent days of his youth. With a letter to his daughter already written, a heartfelt apology and explanation that would reach her only after he was gone, Michael clutched onto the hope of reconciliation and redemption. As the plane soared through clear blue skies, Michael's gaze drifted to the window, watching the landscape below transform from a vibrant tapestry of city life to an abstract mosaic of light and shadow. His thoughts were interrupted when a friendly young woman in a neatly arranged hijab introduced herself as Fatima. She was embarking on a new chapter as a resident at UCLA Medical Center and greeted him with a warmth that belied her own Their brief conversation, filled with polite exchanges and genuine curiosity, hinted at the possibility of shared understanding in the face of life's inevitable trials. Michael's heart, weathered by years of silent regrets, softened as Fatima listened intently to his admission that he was on a journey to right an old wrong. Her nod of encouragement and respectful silence spoke volumes, reinforcing his resolve to face his past head-on, no matter how painful the confrontation might be. Throughout the flight, the ambient hum of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, and the intermittent clatter of service carts provided a soundtrack to a drama that was unfolding quietly, yet inexorably. Elijah's mind oscillated between the sting of the suited man's unyielding hostility and the tender reassurance of Sophie's gentle gestures. Every look, every exchanged smile was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. The disparate lives of these passengers, each with their own burdens and dreams, coalesced in that shared space, turning an ordinary flight into a crucible of emotion and destiny. As turbulence briefly rocked the cabin, a collective shudder passed through the passengers. For Michael, the minor disturbance was a poignant reminder of life's unpredictability and the fleeting nature of time. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gentle vibrations of the aircraft lull him into a reflective state, even as his heart pounded with the urgency of unfinished business. His thoughts turned to James Henderson, the person he had long wronged by his silence all those years ago. The time had come to seek forgiveness and perhaps, in some measure, to find redemption before his final journey on this earth was complete. Back in Elijah's row, the suited man's simmering anger had not abated. His every gesture, every furrowed brow was a stark reminder of a social order that had long devalued men like Elijah. Yet, with each passing minute, Elijah's quiet act of defiance grew into a blazing determination. His eyes met Sophie's across the narrow aisle, and in that silent exchange lay an unspoken promise that the day was not yet lost, that even in the oppressive confines of a cramped airplane cabin, the spark of rebellion could ignite a fire strong enough to consume years of injustice. In the coming hours, as the aircraft sliced through the clear American sky and the landscape below shifted from urban sprawl to rugged natural beauty, the simmering tensions among the passengers promised a climax that would shake the foundations of every preconceived notion. For Elijah Carter, the conflict with the suited man was more than just a battle for physical space. It was a fight for dignity, for recognition, and for the chance to rewrite a story marred by racial bias. And for Michael Kovach, every mile flown was a step toward an overdue reckoning, a chance to atone for a lifetime of unspoken remorse. As the plane leveled off into a serene cruising altitude, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would culminate in a response so grand and unexpected that it would leave every witness breathless with astonishment. In that moment, high above the world, the disparate lives of the passengers converged into a single, powerful narrative of defiance, redemption, and the timeless quest for justice in a world too often marred by cruelty. Elijah Carter felt the heavy tension in the cramped economy cabin as Flight 1742 continued its journey across the vast American sky. At the forward end of the cabin, flight attendant Amara Davis, who had spent 11 years perfecting her art of calming fraught situations while dreaming of Hollywood screenplays, moved through her beverage service with practiced ease. With a gentle smile and a calm, motherly tone that reminded one of a favorite aunt, she handed a plastic cup of ginger ale with no ice to an elderly woman in 14B, and then turned to the man seated in 14C. The suited man, whose name was Warren Caldwell, was absorbed in his phone, until Amara repeated her question, prompting him to mutter, "Oh, bourbon and soda, double if you can swing it," his tone brusque and demanding. While he was busy with his own desires, Amara's attention was drawn to a more subtle but insidious disturbance, unfolding in row 16. There, Elijah Carter and a teenage girl, Sophie, whose striking amber eyes and warm smile contrasted sharply with the bitter chill of Caldwell's disdain, were quietly exchanging notes. Moments earlier, as their gentle banter had filled the space with a spark of camaraderie, Caldwell had already made his disapproving presence known. His eyes burned with a cold fury that spoke of deeply ingrained prejudices. When his gaze fixed on Elijah, it was as if the young man's very existence in that seat was a personal affront to his sense of entitlement. In a low, seething voice that barely concealed his contempt, Caldwell complained to the flight attendant, "Excuse me, but I paid for a seat where I could work in peace. Is there any possibility of moving me to another location? Perhaps in premium economy if there's space available?" His words dripped with hostility as he glared at Elijah and Sophie, who sat silently, trying to focus on their own activities. Amara, always the professional, looked from one face to the other, her heart aching with a familiar sorrow at the sight of unjust discrimination. She gently replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but the flight is completely full today. Is there a specific issue I can help address?" Caldwell lowered his voice, though his venomous tone carried to anyone nearby. "These teenagers are being disruptive, passing notes, giggling, making it impossible to concentrate." Before the girl could speak, Amara raised a hand in a universal gesture, meaning, "Let me handle this," and continued, "With respect, sir, they appear to be conversing quietly, which is perfectly acceptable. We haven't received complaints from any other passengers. I'm sure everyone in this row can make an effort to be considerate of their neighbors for the remainder of the flight." Caldwell's jaw tightened, his thin smile betraying his simmering anger, but he settled back with a curt nod. As Amara walked away, she overheard the girl whisper a soft remark that made Elijah chuckle, a brief moment of light in an otherwise oppressive atmosphere. The entire interaction left Amara with a lingering unease that went beyond the usual inconveniences of cramped seating and fussy passengers. She confided quietly with her colleague James in the galley as they refilled coffee pots and arranged snack packages of pretzels and cookies. "Heads up on row 16, she murmured. "The guy in the suit is giving off serious control freak vibes toward the kids." James, with a knowing shake of his head, agreed. "The boy is black and the girl looks maybe Latina or Middle Eastern, and he keeps looking at them as if they're personally offending him by just being here." Their hushed exchange echoed the painful reality that they had encountered too many times before, a pattern of racially motivated complaints that made Amara's heart heavy. Throughout the flight, as the aircraft soared at 36,000 feet over the endless skies, Elijah struggled to concentrate on his work. He had just begun to review his presentation for the upcoming competition when the pressure of Caldwell's oppressive presence forced him to leave his seat. "Excuse me," he said evenly, addressing Caldwell as he rose to use the restroom. For a fleeting moment, he feared Caldwell might refuse to let him pass, but with an exaggerated display of inconvenience, Caldwell stood and theatrically stepped into the aisle, making a production of even this minor interruption to his work. In that awkward moment, as Elijah slid past, Sophie pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. Unfolding it later, in the privacy of the vacant lavatory, Elijah read her words. "That guy gives me the creeps. If he says anything weird to you when I'm not there, tell me. My mom's a lawyer who specializes in discrimination cases. She'd eat him alive." Despite the tension and his racing heart, Elijah couldn't help but smile at Sophie's fierce loyalty and protective spirit, a small but powerful reminder that he was not alone in this battle. Returning to row 16, Elijah noticed that Caldwell and Sophie had resumed a heated conversation. Sophie's face was flushed with anger and disbelief as Caldwell leaned toward her, speaking in a low, intense voice. "You should be more careful about the company you keep," he said, implying that her association with a young black man like Elijah was somehow dangerous. The implication cut deep, stirring memories of every slight, every patronizing comment Elijah had endured throughout his life. Feeling the familiar weight of injustice settle in his chest, he interjected calmly, "I need to get back to my seat." Caldwell's thin smile reappeared as he stood again, his tone dripping with condescension. "We wouldn't want to keep you from your studies." Once Elijah reclaimed his seat, the quiet murmur of the cabin resumed its uneasy rhythm. Sophie leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "He waited until you left, then started telling me I should be careful around certain types of people. Said he was looking out for my safety. Can you believe that?" Her words resonated with the sorrowful familiarity that Elijah had heard his whole life, the kind of patronizing caution that assumed his very presence was a threat. With a measured tone that belied the anger simmering inside him, Elijah replied that he had encountered this form of racism too many times already, a reminder that society was all too ready to judge him by the color of his skin rather than the merit of his character. In that cramped space, the quiet but persistent acts of cruelty by Caldwell accumulated into a palpable force that made Elijah's pulse quicken with a mix of fear and burgeoning defiance. Every gesture of disdain, every sneer directed his way fanned the flames of a determination that had been smoldering quietly over the years. His mind raced with thoughts of retribution, a grand unyielding response to years of humiliation. He imagined a future where someone like Caldwell would be forced to reckon with the consequences of his unbridled prejudice, where every sneer and every dismissive comment would be answered with a resounding declaration of dignity. Amara, ever observant and empathetic, continued to monitor row 16 as she pushed her snack cart down the aisle. Her thoughts, which often meandered into the creative realms of her screenplay ideas, now fixed on the real-life drama unfolding before her eyes. She recalled how Elijah had managed to maintain his composure with a grace that belied his inner turmoil, his quiet resistance in the face of relentless prejudice, stirring something deep within her. In that moment, she vowed to herself that if the opportunity arose, she would immortalize this struggle in her writing, a testament to the resilience of those who, like Elijah, had been pushed to the margins by a society too often blinded by hatred. As the flight continued, the minor disturbances, the occasional tapping of a stylus on a tablet, the subdued murmurs of discontent, seemed to crystallize into an imminent climax. The confined space of the airplane had become a crucible where decades of systemic racism and personal indignities were finally converging. Elijah's mind churned with images of retribution, not a petty, isolated incident, but a sweeping, cathartic outburst that would render Caldwell's cruelty utterly insignificant. He envisioned a moment when his silence would break into a powerful declaration, a response so grand that it would leave every onlooker breathless and every wrongdoer trembling. That vision was not just a fantasy born of youthful anger. It was a promise of justice long overdue, the spark of rebellion that had ignited when he defiantly reclaimed the shared armrest had now grown into a blazing fire, one that threatened to engulf the entire cabin. Every slight, every dismissive remark had added fuel to the conflagration of his resolve. Elijah could almost hear the roar of vindication, the resounding applause of those who had suffered in silence, and the final triumphant fall of a man like Caldwell, a man whose life had been defined by the cruelty of his prejudices. As the aircraft sliced through the vast expanse of the American sky, the landscape below a shifting mosaic of city lights and rugged terrain, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would redefine the rules of engagement in the face of racism. For Elijah Carter, the next few hours promised not just a continuation of a long journey, but the dawning of an era where he would no longer be forced to endure the pain of discrimination in silence. His determination was taking root, nurtured by every unkind word and every dismissive glance, until it blossomed into a resolute plan for grand retribution. And while the gentle hum of the engines and the intermittent service of Amara and her colleagues provided the backdrop, inside Elijah burned a fervent desire to transform every personal wound into a rallying cry. a testament to the strength of a spirit that refused to be diminished by hate. In that moment, high above the world, amid the confined rows of Flight 1742, a quiet revolution was brewing. The young man who had endured years of unjust treatment was on the brink of unleashing a response so mighty that it would echo far beyond the narrow confines of an airplane cabin. It would be a response that not only restored his dignity, but also sent a clear message to every person who had ever been made to feel inferior. That the time for meek submission was over. The promise of grand retribution loomed on the horizon. A promise that would leave even the most hardened critics in awe, and that, in the hearts of those who had long suffered, would kindle a renewed hope for justice and equality. Elijah Carter sat in his seat on Flight 1742 with a heavy heart and a mind swirling from the barrage of subtle slights and overt insults that had punctuated his journey thus far. The conversation with Warren Caldwell, the suited man whose every word dripped with thinly veiled contempt, had escalated to a point where even the hushed murmur of the airplane seemed to vibrate with tension. Elijah, whose quiet dignity had been tested time and again by a society too eager to pigeonhole him, now found himself trapped in a stifling encounter that forced him to relive the frustrations of a lifetime of microaggressions. When Caldwell casually remarked, "When I was growing up, we didn't have all these special programs and diversity initiatives. We had to earn our achievements on merit alone," his tone was heavy with the arrogance of someone who believed that every success of a young black man was an anomaly. That statement, delivered as if it were a personal challenge, stung Elijah deeply, stirring memories of past rejections and the constant burden of proving himself in a world that judged him by the color of his skin rather than his abilities. Sitting beside him was Sophie, a bright young woman whose amber eyes shone with both warmth and defiance. Earlier, when Caldwell had glared at Elijah with a look that spoke of unspoken accusations and centuries-old prejudices, Sophie had reached out and squeezed his arm in a silent show of solidarity. Her simple act of support, though small, had filled him with a bittersweet mix of comfort and sorrow. Comfort in knowing he was not alone, and sorrow in realizing how common these encounters were. For the next half hour, an uneasy calm settled over row 16. Caldwell busied himself with his tablet, his fingers tapping impatiently as he sipped his scotch on the rocks, while Elijah struggled to concentrate on reviewing his presentation for the upcoming National Science Decathlon. Every now and then, Sophie passed him a small note with a few encouraging words, each one a reminder that his intelligence and hard work were real, even if the world sometimes chose to dismiss them as extraordinary for someone like him. Then, as if spurred by his own mounting frustration and perhaps the burn of too much alcohol, Caldwell finally broke the silence. "So, young man, what takes you to Los Angeles?" he asked in a tone that was ostensibly polite but loaded with condescension. Caught off guard by this unexpected inquiry, Elijah hesitated before replying, in his most measured voice. "I'm competing in the National Science Decathlon. My project is on gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers." His answer, precise and full of quiet pride, was met with a raised eyebrow from Caldwell, whose next words were a backhanded compliment. "Impressive. You must be quite intelligent. It's always encouraging to see young people from diverse backgrounds excelling academically. It shows what can be achieved with the right opportunities." Each word was laced with an implication that Elijah's achievements were not the result of his own merit, but rather the product of special favors and exceptional circumstances, a notion that had been hammered into him from a young age. Before Elijah could muster a rebuttal, Sophie interjected on his behalf, reminding Caldwell that he was indeed speaking to one of only a handful of finalists in the entire country. Caldwell's face betrayed a fleeting flash of surprise before he recovered and asked about Elijah's parents. "And what do your parents do?" he inquired, as if it were a necessary explanation for why Elijah had been granted such opportunities. Elijah's heart pounded as he answered, "My father is a cardiothoracic surgeon, and my mother is a professor of comparative literature." For a moment, something flickered in Caldwell's eyes, a mix of discomfort and the realization that his assumptions were being challenged, before he took another sip of his scotch and mumbled, "Well, good for you." His voice then dripped with an insinuation that success was somehow still an anomaly for someone of Elijah's background. Each pause, each carefully measured syllable from Caldwell seemed designed to remind Elijah of the uphill battle he had fought his entire life. With every remark, the message was clear. His achievements were exceptional because he was an exception in a system that, according to Caldwell's outdated beliefs, was not meant to serve people like him. Sophie's eyes flashed with indignation when Caldwell went on to reminisce about how, in his day, merit alone had determined success. "You know," he said, his tone hardening, "when I was growing up, we didn't have all these programs. We earned everything on merit." Sophie couldn't help but retort softly. Funny how merit alone always seemed to favor certain demographics back then. Her voice, though measured, carried the weight of centuries of injustice. Caldwell's face flushed a deep red, and his eyes narrowed as he shot back, "You're very young. You'll understand better when you've had more life experience." His words, aimed at belittling both Elijah and Sophie, were a stark reminder of the systemic bias that had plagued his generation and continued to haunt the present. Elijah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound sense of injustice. He knew all too well that this kind of exchange was dangerous. It was the sort of confrontation his father had warned him about, a situation where speaking out too forcefully could lead to unwanted repercussions. Yet, as Caldwell's words continued to echo in his ears, Elijah's resolve began to harden. He recalled his father's words, "It's not fair, son, but it's reality. You have to be twice as controlled, twice as careful, twice as aware of how others perceive you." Those words, though meant as a shield against a harsh world, only fueled a burning desire in him to one day level the playing field. Before Elijah could formulate a response that might have been both brave and risky, a timely intervention came in the form of a friendly inquiry from James, a male flight attendant whose arrival seemed perfectly timed. "How are we doing over here? Can I get anyone a refill or another snack?" he asked with a tone that, while cheerful, carried the unmistakable note of authority. Caldwell, perhaps realizing that he was on the verge of crossing an official line, curtly replied that he was fine and requested water instead. The interruption provided a momentary pause, but the charged atmosphere in row 16 remained palpable. Sophie exchanged a look with Elijah, a silent acknowledgement of the shared battle they were fighting in that cramped space. As the conversation subsided, an uncomfortable silence settled over the row. Caldwell returned to his tablet, his body language shifting from condescension to a closed, defensive posture, while Elijah's mind raced. The confrontation had left him unsettled not only because of Caldwell's brazen racism, but also because of the personal toll it exacted on him. Every remark, every insinuation reminded him of the relentless pressure to be the perfect exemplar in a system stacked against him. The weight of these expectations was nearly crushing, and Elijah found himself longing for a moment of respite, a chance to breathe and gather his strength for the battles that lay ahead. In the midst of that tension, Elijah's thoughts drifted to the larger picture. He knew that Caldwell's outdated views and his blatant disrespect were just symptoms of a much deeper, systemic injustice that had plagued America for generations. He thought about the countless individuals who faced daily discrimination without any shield of privilege, and the idea of retribution began to take shape in his mind. Not a petty revenge, but a grand act of justice that would send shockwaves through every room where prejudice dared to speak. He imagined a future where every racist sneer and every condescending remark would be met with a resounding declaration of dignity. A future where his voice, and the voices of those like him, would finally break through the cacophony of bigotry. For the remainder of the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed and the window shades were drawn against the harsh sunlight at 36,000 feet, Elijah struggled to settle into a restless sleep. His body ached from the tension of the past hour, his mind still aflame with the memory of Caldwell. When he finally awoke with a jolt, disoriented by the hum of engines and the recycled air, he glanced around and noted that Caldwell was still at his side, now engrossed in what appeared to be a presentation he was preparing on his tablet. Sophie lay asleep beside him, her book abandoned on her lap, while the soft murmur of other passengers provided a dull backdrop to his inner turmoil. At that moment, Elijah's need for water and a moment of relief grew pressing, but the prospect of having to disturb Caldwell once more filled him with dread. He weighed his options, his mind racing with both physical discomfort and the ever-present threat of another verbal onslaught. Each decision felt like walking a tightrope between preserving his dignity and risking further humiliation. As he sat there, feeling the dull ache in his neck and the dryness in his throat, he resolved that this flight, with all its trials and tribulations, would not be just another instance of silent suffering. It would be the spark that ignited a revolution within him, a promise that one day, the injustices he endured would be met with a response so magnificent and cathartic that even the most hardened hearts would be moved. High above the sprawling American landscape, in that narrow economy cabin where every inch of space was contested, Elijah Carter began to envision a future where his silence would be replaced by a triumphant roar. A future where every act of discrimination would be answered by the collective strength of those who refused to be diminished. And as the plane carried him closer to Los Angeles, each minute stretching into an eternity, he clung to that vision with a desperate. The battle between Caldwell's entrenched cruelty and his own resilient spirit was far from over, and the promise of grand retribution lingered on the horizon. A promise that one day justice would prevail, leaving every witness in awe and every oppressor trembling at the might of true, unyielding dignity. Elijah Carter shifted in his seat with a quiet determination as he excused himself, saying softly, "Excuse me, I need to get up." Warren Caldwell gave him a sour glance but allowed him to pass, his expression a mix of irritation and condescension that made every step Elijah took feel like a small victory over a lifetime of subtle injustice. In the narrow aisle of the airplane, Elijah stretched discreetly, trying to ease the tension in his back without drawing attention from the other passengers. As he made his way toward the rear lavatories, he exchanged a nod with flight attendant James, who was busy organizing the galley for the next service. When James asked in a friendly tone, "Everything okay?" Elijah replied, "Fine, thanks, just needed to stretch my legs," and James added with a conspiratorial wink, "Let us know if you need anything. Sometimes a seating reassignment magically becomes possible mid-flight." Elijah couldn't help but smile despite the constant weight of hostility that had followed him since takeoff, replying that he appreciated the concern, even though he knew they would soon be landing. After a brief wait in the lavatory, where the cramped space allowed him a moment of relief, Elijah emerged feeling marginally refreshed. He noticed that the aisle was partly blocked by a service cart as flight attendants prepared for the second round of beverage service. Instead of forcing his way through and risking an awkward collision, he waited patiently. From his vantage point near the aisle, he could see most of the economy cabin, including his own row where Sophie, his steadfast ally with those striking amber eyes, still slept peacefully. Across the aisle, Caldwell was deep in conversation with an older white gentleman who nodded in agreement with every word Caldwell uttered. Although their voices were low and barely carried, every gesture and every subtle nod spoke volumes about a shared perspective that filled Elijah with a sense of foreboding. As Elijah waited for the aisle to clear, his attention was drawn to an older man a few rows behind, perhaps in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and weathered, kind features. Unlike many passengers lost in their own digital worlds or succumbing to the drowsy hume of the flight, this man was alert and observant, scanning the cabin with a thoughtful gaze. When their eyes met for just a moment, there was an unspoken connection. A silent nod of mutual understanding that made Elijah feel as though someone else recognized the injustice he silently endured. The older man returned to his book after that brief exchange, leaving Elijah with a quiet reassurance that he was not invisible, even in this cramped metal tube hurtling across America. The service cart finally moved forward, clearing the aisle so that Elijah could return to his seat. As he passed, Caldwell, still engrossed in his conversation with his new companion, stood and let him pass with barely a word, just a curt, dismissive remark that drifted on the air. No respect for traditional values anymore. Elijah's heart sank at the sound, not because he felt personally attacked at that moment, but because each word reinforced the systemic prejudice he had long fought against. Settling back into his seat, he removed his earbuds and listened as Caldwell continued to engage in a conversation that was all too familiar. The man across the aisle, clearly a kindred spirit of Caldwell, said, "Everything's about being woke now, whatever that means." The casual tone in which he dismissed traditional values as if they were relics of a bygone era made Elijah's skin crawl. He quickly replaced his earbuds, choosing instead a playlist that would mask the toxic banter drifting through the cabin. Sophie stirred beside him and, blinking awake, asked in a hushed voice, "What did I miss?" Elijah simply replied with a half smile, "Just making new friends," while discreetly nodding toward the heated conversation. Sophie listened for a moment, her expression shifting from sleepy confusion to a look of disgust as she caught snippets of Caldwell's words about how his grandson had returned from college spouting talk of white privilege and systemic racism. The older man he was speaking with scoffed. "My grandson came home from college talking about all that. I told him, I grew up poor in Alabama. Where was my privilege?" Caldwell nodded vigorously, fueling his own justification as he continued, "They're indoctrinating them plain and simple, making them feel guilty for being white and successful." Sophie's eyes glittered with a mix of anger and amusement as she whispered, "Wow, he found his people, huh? Birds of a feather?" She teasingly added, "Should we start our own loud conversation about critical race theory and gender fluidity? Really give them something to complain about?" Elijah chuckled softly, the humor lightening the oppressive atmosphere for a moment. But his smile quickly faded into a look of weary resignation. "Tempting," he admitted, "but probably not the wisest move when we're still trapped here for another 2 hours." Sophie pouted playfully and then grew more serious, asking, "Seriously though, are you okay? That guy's been low-key hostile since takeoff, and it's obviously about more than just us being disruptive teenagers." Elijah nodded, his tone even yet laced with underlying bitterness. "I'm fine," he assured her. "This isn't my first encounter with someone like him, and I know it won't be my last." Their whispered conversation was interrupted when the beverage cart reached their row. Flight attendant Amara greeted them with her usual professional smile, asking, "Any drinks for you folks?" Elijah ordered water and Sophie joined him, while Caldwell from his seat demanded another scotch and then a double this time. Amara's smile never wavered, though her eyes briefly flickered toward Elijah and Sophie in a silent message of solidarity. "I would be happy to bring you another beverage, sir, but I need to limit the alcohol to 1 per service," she explained in a calm, measured tone. "I can offer you a soft drink or coffee as an alternative." Caldwell's jaw tightened, and he replied in a clipped tone, "Is that a new policy? I've flown this route dozens of times and never encountered this restriction." Amara explained further, "It is at the discretion of the flight crew, based on various factors including flight duration and overall cabin management." Her explanation was so confidently delivered that it left no room for argument. Recognizing he could not press the issue, Caldwell grumbled, "Coffee then, black." As Amara prepared the drinks, Elijah noticed her sharing a subtle nod with James, a small, private gesture that confirmed they were watching over row 16 more carefully than usual. When she handed Elijah his water, a neatly folded napkin tucked underneath read, "All good," in small, discreet handwriting. The kind gesture brought a warm glow to his heart. It was a reminder that for every Caldwell in the world, there were kind souls like Amara and James who recognized injustice and quietly did their part to ease its sting. Soon after, Sophie nudged Elijah and said in a hushed tone, "So tell me more about these gravitational waves, and please use the biggest, most complicated physics terms possible. I want to watch your brain explode trying to follow along." Her playful challenge was a clear attempt to diffuse the tension and reclaim a sense of normalcy amid the charged atmosphere. For the next 15 minutes, Elijah launched into a detailed explanation of his project on gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers, using intricate scientific terminology that even drew a reluctant nod of admiration from Caldwell, whose face remained impassive but whose eyes betrayed a flicker of discomfort. Every articulate explanation and every incisive question from Sophie seemed to grate against Caldwell's narrow-minded assumptions, and while he said nothing, his clenched fist around his coffee cup and the stiff set of his shoulders spoke volumes. It was as if each word from Elijah was a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that intelligence and achievement were not determined by the color of one's skin, but by dedication and hard work. As the overhead announcement came, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rivera. We have begun our initial descent into Los Angeles International Airport." Elijah felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation. The final descent promised not only the end of the tense hours aboard Flight 1742, but also a moment of potential transformation. Local time was 4:17 p.m., the weather clear with comfortable temperatures around 72 degrees, and the cabin began its final preparations for landing. Amid the flurry of final instructions, stowing trays, returning seats to the upright position, Sophie discreetly texted her dad to let him know they were about to land, explaining in a soft, affectionate tone, "My dad worries if he doesn't hear from me at every checkpoint." Classic divorced dad overcompensation. Elijah smiled as he imagined her father's anxious monitoring of the flight tracker, a tiny airplane icon on a smartphone screen. Then, with a touch of unexpected warmth, Sophie proposed, "Hey, maybe we could exchange numbers in case you want someone to show you around LA while you're here." Elijah, whose earlier reservations had given way to a flicker of hope, agreed, saying, "That would be great, actually." They exchanged contact information, sealing a small but significant friendship that had grown amid adversity. Throughout this ordeal, despite Caldwell's ever-watchful eyes and his palpable disapproval, Elijah felt a renewed sense of self-worth. In that confined space, where racial bias and entrenched prejudice had sought to diminish him, he had found not only a kindred spirit in Sophie, but also a quiet, unyielding promise that one day his response to such cruelty would be grand and unequivocal. The final moments of the flight were filled with a mixture of relief and simmering resolve as the aircraft descended over the sprawling city below. Every glance exchanged, every whispered word, served as a reminder that while the journey through systemic racism was far from over, even in the most oppressive circumstances, dignity and resilience could triumph. As the airplane touched down on the runway, Elijah Carter knew that he had survived another battle. A battle fought not with shouts or fury, but with the calm determination of a man who refused to let injustice define him. When the airplane began its descent over the distinctive coastline, Sophie leaned over and asked in a gentle tone, "First impressions?" Elijah Carter, who had endured so much on this flight, smiled wearily and replied, "It's big, really big, and honey, just wait until you're stuck in traffic in Los Angeles. It feels even bigger." Their light conversation was a welcome distraction from the stomach-dropping sensation of landing and from the constant tension that had followed them all flight long, especially from Warren Caldwell, whose disapproving glare still loomed over every word and gesture. As the aircraft touched down with a slight bump that made the nervous passengers break into scattered applause, the familiar post-landing routine began. The seatbelt sign turned off with a cheerful ding, and despite repeated announcements to remain seated until the aircraft had come to a complete stop, people scrambled for their phones and bags as if escaping from trouble. The captain's warm greeting echoed over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles International Airport. Local time is 4:43 p.m. Please remain seated until we have come to a complete stop. For your safety, be cautious when opening the overhead bins, as items may have shifted during flight." At that moment, Elijah felt the knot of tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Soon he would be off this plane and away from Caldwell, focusing instead on the science competition that might secure his future at a prestigious university. The ordeal of Flight 1742, with its undercurrent of racial prejudice and personal humiliation, would become just another hard-earned lesson in a world that too often judged him unfairly. Beside him, Sophie was already gathering her belongings, tucking her well-worn book into a colorful backpack adorned with pins and patches that told stories of her own battles and triumphs. "So, competition tomorrow," she said softly. "What time do you present?" Elijah replied, "The preliminary round is at 10 a.m., and if I make it to the finals, that's at 3 p.m. With a playful glint in her eye, Sophie added, "Sending good vibes your way, though I'm sure you don't need them. Anyone who can explain quantum gravity to a sleep-deprived teenager on a plane is bound to crush a science competition." Elijah laughed, grateful for her words of encouragement. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," he said. "And for making this flight bearable. Without you as my buffer, I might have thrown my book at Mr. Corporate America over there." He lowered his voice for the last remark, for he knew that Caldwell was still within earshot. His eyes narrowed, and his jaw set in a permanent scowl. As the plane taxied slowly toward the gate and finally came to a stop with a slight lurch, the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers surged to their feet in a universal rush to deplane. "Let me get your number really quick," Elijah said, reaching for his phone in his pocket. But in that moment, as he turned slightly to retrieve the device, his elbow bumped against Caldwell's arm. The collision was small, but it was enough to jostle Caldwell's coffee cup. The remaining bourbon splashed onto his tablet, which he had been holding in his lap with all the care of someone trying to protect his precious work. "Watch it," Caldwell snapped, his voice sharp enough to draw attention from nearby passengers. He grabbed a napkin and hastily wiped at the screen, his tone dripping with contempt. "Are you always this clumsy, or is it just when you're trying to impress your little girlfriend?" he sneered. The sudden hostility of his words struck Elijah like a physical blow. His face flushed with heat, not out of embarrassment, but from the raw anger he had long fought to keep under control. "It was an accident," Elijah said evenly, his voice calm despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I apologize." But Caldwell was not willing to let it go. "An accident," he repeated with disbelief and bitterness, as if the mishap were a convenient excuse for all the disruptive behavior he claimed to endure. "Just like it was an accident that you kept disrupting my work all flight. Just like it was an accident that you couldn't keep your voices down or stay in your own space." His accusations were outrageous and far removed from reality, steeped in a deep-seated bitterness that had little to do with any actual incident. For a brief moment, Elijah was rendered speechless, overwhelmed by the cruelty in Caldwell's words. Before Elijah could muster a more forceful response, Sophie intervened with a calm firmness that betrayed nothing of the pain she felt. "Seriously, we've been practically tiptoeing around you this entire flight while you've been nothing but rude and condescending," she said. "It was just a tiny spill. Get over it." Caldwell's gaze snapped to her, his expression hardening as he retorted, "This is precisely the problem with your generation. No respect, no accountability," he continued, his voice rising in volume so that nearby passengers began to listen intently. "You think you can do whatever you want without consequences. You think you can treat people however you please because you're older. You're wearing an expensive suit, and you have some corporate job that makes you feel important." Sophie fired back with exhausted determination. "That is not how it works, and I will not stand by while you treat us like we are less than human." At that moment, Elijah felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the cabin upon him. It was as if the world had narrowed down to this single confrontation, where his very existence was being questioned by Caldwell's baseless insinuations. "Sophie, it's fine," he murmured quietly. "Let's just get our bags and go." But Sophie's eyes blazed with indignation. "No, it's not fine," she insisted. You have been treated terribly all flight for no reason at all." Caldwell, his voice rising even further, challenged, "Except what? Go ahead, say it. Make it about race if you must." The charged words hung in the air, dangerous and provocative. Elijah felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture under the relentless barrage of insults. He remembered his father's cautionary words about public confrontations and the fine line a young black man had to walk in such situations, where any misstep could be used to further tarnish his character. Just then, a voice of authority broke through the escalating chaos. "Sir, I think that's enough," said Amara, the flight attendant who had long managed the cabin with calm professionalism. "We have arrived at the gate, and passengers are trying to deplane. If you have any complaints, please speak with a customer service representative inside the terminal." Caldwell turned to argue, but before he could continue, another voice cut in from across the aisle, the voice of the older gentleman who had been quietly observing from earlier. "The kid bumped him on purpose," he declared, even though he had never spoken to Elijah, adding fuel to the already volatile situation. Sophie immediately shot back. "That's a lie. You couldn't possibly have seen that because it didn't happen. He was just getting his phone out when Mr. Jerk overreacted." Caldwell's eyes flared with anger as he warned, "Young lady, you need to watch your tone and stay out of matters that don't concern you." Sophie's reply was swift and unwavering. "Defending my friend from racist bullying absolutely concerns me." Caldwell's voice rose further, his words now laced unmistakably with prejudice as he shouted, "Racist? Racist?" His tone became so shrill that it drew even more attention from the surrounding passengers. Amara stepped in firmly again, her voice carrying that unmistakable authority that came from years of experience. "There is enough commotion already. Sir, please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft. And you two, please wait until the aisle is clear before deplaning." Caldwell interpreted her instructions as an insult, sneering, "So they give you special treatment. You caused the problem, and I'm the one being asked to leave first?" Amara calmly replied, "I am simply trying to manage an orderly deplaning process. Now please, if you would." What happened next occurred so fast that time seemed to slow. Caldwell, his face red with fury, rose from his seat and, in his anger, his hand, whether by accident or design, made contact with Elijah's shoulder, pushing him forcefully back into his seat. Startled and unable to fully process the sudden physical aggression, Elijah instinctively raised his arm in defense. In the cramped confines of the narrow aisle, Caldwell's push resulted in a momentary loss of balance. "Don't you dare put your hands on me," Caldwell bellowed, his voice booming through the cabin. And then, in a moment of unthinkable brutality, Caldwell's open palm struck Elijah squarely across the face. The sharp crack of the slap reverberated like a gunshot, freezing everyone in the cabin in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Elijah sat stunned, his cheek burning with the sting of the blow, as Sophie gasped in horror, her hand flying to her mouth. For a split second, even Amara's professional mask faltered, revealing genuine alarm before she quickly regained her composure. "Sir, you need to step back immediately," she ordered, her voice now edged with steel. "James, I need assistance in row 16. Caldwell, momentarily taken aback by his own outburst, stood frozen, his hand still raised as if he could not believe what he had just done. In that charged moment, Michael Kovach, the older gentleman from earlier, the one with the salt and pepper hair and the wise, weathered face, rose from his seat 7 rows back. With deliberate and measured steps, Michael made his way forward. His back was turned to Elijah, yet his eyes were locked on Caldwell with a calm intensity that commanded respect. "You will not touch this young man again," Michael declared firmly, his words slicing through the tension. Caldwell, trying to regain some semblance of control, puffed himself up and retorted, "This doesn't concern you, old man, step aside." But Michael's reply was resolute. "It concerns all of us. When a man like you strikes a child in public, it becomes everyone's concern." Caldwell sneered. "He's a tall teenager being disrespectful. before Michael interrupted. "I saw everything from 7 rows back. I saw you harassing him and demeaning him all flight." The confrontation reached its boiling point as more passengers began to murmur, their eyes wide with shock, and the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Amara, now with James at her side, called out once more, "Sir, please sit down immediately. We are now deplaning, and any further misconduct will be reported." Caldwell's face twisted with a mix of fury and disbelief as he realized that his actions had drawn not only the attention of the flight crew, but the condemnation of those around him. In that moment, as the reality of what he had done sank in, a hush fell over the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks of sympathetic concern toward Elijah, whose eyes shone with unshed tears even as he tried to steady his breath. Sophie clutched his hand tightly, her gaze unwavering, as if to say that in this world there were still people who would stand up for what was right. And then, as the final boarding announcement was made and the aircraft's doors swung open, it was clear that the events of Flight 1742 would not be easily forgotten. Elijah Carter, though wounded in body and spirit, sat with a newfound resolve. The pain of Caldwell's slap would serve not as a mark of defeat, but as a catalyst for a grand retribution. A promise that one day, every hateful word and every cruel act would be answered with a justice so magnificent, it would leave even the most hardened oppressors trembling. In that small, cramped economy cabin, as passengers began to file out into the bright afternoon light, a quiet revolution had been sparked. A revolution in which the dignity of one young man, and by extension the dignity of every person who had ever been demeaned by racial prejudice, would one day triumph over the cruelty of those like Warren Caldwell. Elijah Carter sat in disbelief as the final moments of Flight 1742 unraveled into chaos. In the bustling terminal, amidst the hum of deplaning passengers, Warren Caldwell's true colors exploded into view. "I watched you create conflict where there was none," Caldwell sneered, his voice cold and venomous. His righteous indignation faltered under the steady, unwavering gaze of Michael Kovach, a wise, weathered gentleman who had stepped forward like a guardian angel. "I understand the context of a man who believes his age, his race, and his wealth give him the right to demand deference," Michael declared with calm authority, his words slicing through the tension in the cabin. As uniformed officers arrived to escort the fuming Caldwell away, passengers exchanged sympathetic glances. Sophie's gentle concern for Elijah mingled with the silent support of Michael, whose strong handshake and compassionate eyes spoke of battles fought long before this day. In that charged moment, Elijah felt both the sting of Caldwell's slap and the powerful surge of vindication. His face, marked by the painful blow, became a symbol of resilience, a testament that one day every hateful act would be answered with justice so magnificent it would leave oppressors trembling. As Elijah, Sophie, and Michael prepared to give their statements, the memory of this day etched itself into their hearts as a turning point in the fight for dignity and equality. Tristan Jefferson stood quietly as an officer led him into a small terminal office to recount the harrowing events of Flight 1742. The officer's steady tone explained that Caldwell's assault on this young man, an act witnessed by countless passengers, could lead to serious charges, but the decision was now Tristan's to make. Pressing charges meant not only potential court appearances and unwanted media attention, but also a disruption of his carefully planned future at MIT. Yet, the thought of allowing a man like Caldwell, who had built his life on entitlement and cruelty, to face no consequences filled Tristan with a deep, burning resolve. Outside, Sophie and Michael Kovach waited, their expressions a mix of concern and unwavering support. Sophie's passionate insistence that justice must prevail, and Michael's calm wisdom, reminded Tristan that true retribution comes in many forms, not solely from legal proceedings, but from standing up to racism in all its guises. As Tristan's cheek still stung from the brutal slap, he realized that this painful moment would mark a turning point in his life. With his heart heavy, yet his spirit resolute, he vowed that his truth would be heard, and that one day those who oppressed would be held accountable for their cruelty, inspiring others to rise against injustice. Tristan Jefferson sat in the hushed aftermath of Flight 1742's chaos, his mind awash with conflicting emotions that blurred the line between pain and possibility. As the aircraft's doors swung open and the warm, late-afternoon light of Los Angeles International Airport flooded the cabin, he could barely believe that just hours before, a single act of cruelty had changed everything. In that crowded terminal where passengers milled about with bags and anxious glances, the echo of a vicious slap still reverberated in his heart. A slap delivered by Warren Caldwell, a man whose entitled arrogance and relentless prejudice had long defined his existence. Caldwell's hand, raised in an unprovoked outburst, had struck Tristan's cheek with a force that left a burning reminder of the brutality of unchecked racism. Yet, it was in that moment of public humiliation that something deep within Tristan stirred, a spark of defiance and the promise of retribution that would redefine his future. After the incident, as uniformed officers led Caldwell away for questioning and the murmurs of shocked passengers filled the air, Tristan found himself alone in a small interview room, recounting every detail to an officer whose calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the earlier frenzy. The officer explained in measured tones that an assault on a minor was a grave offense, and that the choice to press charges was now Tristan's to make. The weight of that decision pressed heavily on him. Pressing charges would thrust him into a media spotlight he never wanted, disrupting his carefully charted path to MIT and the promise of a bright future built on his academic brilliance. Yet, letting Caldwell walk free, allowing that vile act to pass without consequence, was equally unbearable. Tristan's heart ached with the realization that every insult, every dismissive remark had accumulated over the years into this single, defining moment. Outside the interview room, his steadfast friend Sophie waited with Michael Kovach, the elder statesman of quiet courage who had risen up to defend Tristan when no one else would. Sophie's eyes shone with fierce empathy and indignation as she embraced Tristan, whispering, "You have nothing to be ashamed of. We're here for you." Michael's presence radiated a wisdom born of decades of struggle, a man who had witnessed the worst of human cruelty and yet chosen to act with honor and resolve. "Speak your truth plainly," Michael had told Tristan earlier, his firm yet gentle tone cutting through the tension like a lighthouse beam through fog. "What happened is clear, and justice must be served." In those words, Michael carried not only his own scars from a life once marred by discrimination, but also the silent, lingering pain of a past that had stretched back to 1975, a time when the seeds of today's hate were sown and nurtured. As Tristan stepped back into the terminal, his mind reeled with the enormity of the day's events. The sting on his cheek was a physical reminder of Caldwell's cruelty, but it was also a catalyst, a call to arms against the systemic injustices that had long defined his life as a young black man in America. The circle, which had begun so long ago in a different era, was finally closing. The past and present converged in ways Tristan had never imagined possible, fusing together the old wounds of racial oppression with the burning need for a triumphant response. He recalled Michael's quiet declaration from the flight, "Not this time," words that rang like a battle cry against the long-standing tyranny of prejudice. Those three words promised redemption and healing, setting the stage for a response that would shake the very foundations of a society built on inequality. In the crowded waiting area, as Tristan exchanged a few final words with Sophie and Michael, he felt a surge of resolve. He knew that while the decision to press charges would bring challenges, court dates, public scrutiny, and painful memories, it was also an opportunity to stand up for himself, and for every person who had ever been demeaned by Caldwell's kind of unchecked brutality. His heart pounded with the certainty that this was not just about one man's lapse in judgment. It was about holding accountable those who used their wealth, status, and race as weapons against the vulnerable. In that moment, Tristan vowed that he would not let the hateful legacy of Caldwell's actions define him. Instead, he would transform his pain into a resounding act of justice, a retribution so grand that even the most hardened oppressors would be forced to reckon with their cruelty. Walking toward the exit where his patient shuttle driver waited, Tristan felt a strange mix of sorrow and empowerment. He was now at a crossroads where forgiveness, accountability, and the promise of a better future were all intertwined. His journey, though marred by an act of vicious discrimination, had ignited a spark that would fuel a quest for true justice. Michael's parting words echoed in his mind, reminding him that the true measure of a man was not in the blows he delivered, but in the strength to rise and reclaim his dignity. In that final, transformative moment, Tristan Jefferson, no longer a silent victim but a determined force for change, stepped into the future with a promise that the legacy of oppression would finally be met with a response so monumental it would leave the world saying, "Wow."